Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're very, very happy that you could all join us, that you're here with us. This will be a very fruitful conversation, enlightening, I believe. This is Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, Working Through the United Nations, a book discussion. And so it's based on a recent book, and you'll hear all about it from John Dugard, Richard Falk, and Michael Lynk with a preface or an introduction from Francesca Albanese. Forgive me, my pronunciation. You can correct that later. And I just want to, before we begin, I wanted to send a very big thank you to our co-sponsors for this webinar. So the Disciples Church PIN, that's Palestine Israel Network, the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, Palestine Israel Network, the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, Kairos USA, Menopin, the Mennonite Palestine Israel Network, with Pax Christi USA, the Catholic organization, Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, the United Church of Christ PIN, and the United Methodists for Kairos Response, or UMKR. So just thank you so much for these amazing groups. Check them out on your free time. They're doing amazing work for justice. And as we move on, I just wanted to point out some housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so plan accordingly with regards to whether you want your video on or your name. You can easily turn off your video or adjust your name. We understand everyone has different security and privacy needs. So just wanted to remind you that this is being recorded. There will be Q&A, question and answer, towards the end, and please utilize the chat function. So any question you have, feel free to write it in the chat and at any time, and then we'll take it and use that later. And then in the chat section and in the conversation, we here at FOSNA, I think it's hard to beat the golden rule: in everything do to others as you would have them do for you, for this is the law and the prophets. And that's about as good for interpersonal interactions as it is political philosophy. So that's how we will go forward. We are Friends of Sabeel North America, a Christian voice for Palestine, and we are very excited to be here to present on this book, which is the same name as the webinar, Protecting Human Rights in Occupied Palestine, Working Through the United Nations. It's available from Clarity Press and any booksellers that you like, but it's from Clarity Press, and I'll put a link in the comments here soon. And now I'm going to pass it over to our facilitator, our host, Jonathan Kuttab, my boss, but he's the executive director of FOSNA, Friends of Sabeel North America. He's also an international human rights attorney, co-founder of the Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq, and co-founder of Nonviolence International. So, Jonathan, please.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Jesse Wheeler, administrative assistant and the real force behind what FOSNA is doing. Thank you very much, Jesse. We have such a powerful panel. Not only are they powerful in their own rights, but they also are professors. So we have to really work hard to keep them down to a minimum in terms of time, so that we can benefit from their wisdom as much as possible. I will start by asking Professor Richard Falk to tell us a little bit about how this book came about. And why is it important?
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, FOSNA, for convening this event and all the congenial co-sponsors. It's very encouraging to us that this kind of broad backing for an event devoted to our book, especially now that the situation facing the Palestinian people has become quite desperate and requires all of us to take it as seriously as we are able. The book itself came about because at the end of Michael Lynk's term, the three of us who collaborated on this book served successive 6-year terms as special rapporteur. There was a short interval in between the end of my period and Michael's beginning. But what made me think that this was a good undertaking was that we combined a friendship and awareness of each other's work and a similarity of experience in trying to report honestly about the realities of the Israeli occupation and its defiance of international law, that it was important to show that continuity from the perspective of the three of us, who, although we knew each other and respected each other's work, came from quite different juridical and even national backgrounds. So that, I'm pleased to say that Francesca, who's the current special rapporteur, also reinforces that sense of continuity of observation and judgment about the character of what is experienced by the Palestinian people as the most flagrant denial of their fundamental rights, and including and especially the right of self-determination. We also, although there was this continuity between our observation, analysis, and appraisal, there was a sense that this situation was evolving in a menacing way, and that it was important to understand the evolution through time of what was for many people sort of a static situation. It wasn't static at all for the Palestinians who experienced intensifying repression. And it was also the case that each of us encountered obstacles to carrying out the role that the UN had given to us. And this became more severe maybe 10, 12 years ago when Israel and its most ardent supporters around the world began weaponizing anti-Semitism as a way of substituting the messenger for the message in addressing these concerns. So I'm happy to report that this collaboration, which any book collaboration, as authors know, is a kind of mini marriage, and this one worked out, I think, very well in the end, which in my experience is not always the case. And we think it's important because the situation that exists today and is so desperate comes out of a past that inflicted injustice from the very inception of the United Nations. And it was an injustice that the UN failed in its responsibility to do very much about. And so on that basis, I think the book tries to depict the past and present and evolving reality.
Well, thank you, Professor. I will turn a little to Professor Lynk now and give us something of the substance, if you can give in a very brief summary. What is the message? What have you, in fact, all three of you as special rapporteurs found to be the situation in the occupied territories?
Well, I think if you as you go through the book, what it is each of the three authors has written two personal essays with respect to what we were working through the United Nations, and also what some of our own experiences were while we were special rapporteurs. The bulk of the book would be excerpts from our various reports. As special rapporteurs, we would write 2 reports a year, delivered in the spring or summer to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and in the fall to the General Assembly. And speaking for myself, I chose to address a theme in each of my 12 reports. I've looked at issues like collective punishment, issues with respect to the right to health or the right to development. I've also looked at more urgent issues, which I think is coming close to trying to answer your question. 3 of my 12 reports dealt with the issue of accountability. And if there's anything that is an enormous gap in the international supervision of the question of Palestine, it is the absolute lack of accountability. The United Nations, through its various bodies, particularly the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council, have all passed numerous resolutions, and I think you can count them in the hundreds, with respect to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, with respect to legal and human rights aspects of the occupation. They've been extremely critical of Israel. Israel does not accept that it's an occupation. It does not accept that it has no sovereign right to claim any part of the land. It claims it has a right to build settlements, which are absolutely forbidden under various instruments in international law. And this occupied, I think, all 3 of our us as a major component of our work, is pointing out the enormous gap between what the international community says through these UN resolutions, and what the international community does, or more likely doesn't do, with respect to taking action with respect to this. I think all 3 of us learned to our bitterness, that criticism without consequences winds up being meaningless. And if Israel, as we can call it, as an acquisitive occupying power, learns that an occasional trip to the dentist to get a checkup by the Security Council, which means drilling in a little bit of teeth, and yet nothing of any substance ever happens with respect to these Security Council resolutions, even though there is a provision in the Charter of the United Nations which says every member of the United Nations agrees to obey all decisions of the Security Council, and that does not take place with respect to Israel. Then what we're left being doing as special rapporteurs and human rights international lawyers is to point out to the international community that international law is not a menu a la carte. You cannot have international law for thee, but not for me. It applies to all of us, and particularly with respect to Israel. And the last point I'll make is we are concerned, as we should be, with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with respect to the occupation of Ukraine and the claims of sovereignty by Russia over parts of Ukraine. But with the same thing happening with over a term of more than 5 decades, with respect to Israel occupying the Palestinian territories, claiming sovereignty over them, and yet with nothing to show, particularly from the global north, this tells us that there's all the more need for changes to occur in international policymaking. And this will occur probably not from the top down. This will occur from the bottom up. I mean, I think, a major audience for the reports of all 3 of us would be aimed towards civil societies and to human rights organizations and to the international human rights movement. That's where change is going to come about. And that's where it's going to come up from below to try to alter the decision-making of powers from above.
Well, I will turn now to Francesca with a technical question. I know many lay people, when they think of the United Nations, they think of the Security Council, where the United States wields almost consistently the power of the veto to prevent any application or any implementation of international law. Are there any other vehicles within the United Nations system, such as maybe the Committee for Decolonization or some other tool within the United Nations Rapporteur that can, in fact, be useful for Palestinians in applying international law?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And let me start by thanking FOSNA and all of you who are present with us tonight. There are instruments, there are human rights mechanisms, supervising treaty bodies, the compliance with international law of each member state, and there could be other instruments. There is the International Court of Justice, there is the ICC, and because I do agree with Michael, and when it comes to accountability, here's where there is a huge gap in the relations between Israel and Palestine. But the point is that eventually the United Nations are made of states, and if there is this unwillingness in among certain states, particularly in the West, and which translates into a lack of compliance with basic rules, with basic principles, with a basic concept of dignity. You can activate all the mechanisms you want, but eventually there will be this wall of denial, this impossibility to enforce recommendations. So I don't think that we should further inflate the system. We should go with what we have. International law is very clear. There are hundreds of UN resolutions which denounce, not necessarily calling illegality, but it is the illegality of Israeli occupation. And we should really reactivate that pact, that it's at the civil society level for compliance, for pushing states to comply with international law without creating other instruments. This is my view.
Yes, I guess my question is also to the other two professors on the technical legal level. We have been using the language of states, annexation, application of Geneva and Hague Convention to occupied territories. But after 50 years of occupation, this is no longer a temporary situation. This is now a permanent, basically acquisition, annexation, clearly illegal. But beyond that, the whole analysis of two states side by side, one state occupying or trying to annex the territory of another, seems to be no longer operative. People now are talking in terms of apartheid, in terms of a whole system of settler colonialism, which requires decolonization. So at the technical level of international law, are we now in need of moving beyond the paradigm and the language that we have been using so far?
Maybe I can begin by saying that the issue, the prime issue, is the lack of geopolitical ambition to enforce international law. And specifically, it is an indictment of the U.S. role as the unconditional protector of Israel, despite its flagrant violation through the decades of international law in its most basic form. And we have to remember, as you pointed out, Jonathan, that the UN was designed to be weak when it comes to the powers that won World War II. Otherwise, the veto makes no sense. It makes no sense to give the most dangerous countries in the world the unrestricted option of saying they are not subject to the Charter or to international law. It's a deep contradiction in the sense that the accountability that is imposed by international law is fundamentally directed at the weak, not imposing constraints on the strong. And so it is very helpful to shift the focus to settler colonialism and to understand that this underlying conflict is one where the long-term Zionist project has been to displace the Palestinians from their own homeland. And the essence of settler colonialism is that the settlers must totally marginalize the resident inhabitants of their own homeland. And in those cases where settler colonialism has succeeded, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, in all those cases, the native peoples were marginalized totally. And where it failed in South Africa, it was never possible to replace the majority African population, and a global solidarity movement, as Michael suggested, changed the balance of forces sufficiently that the white apartheid elite overnight decided that they'd be better off with a constitutional democracy than continuing what the apartheid practices and policies. Until that happens with Israel, I don't see the prospect of international law becoming effective. In other words, Israel has to feel the pain of outside pressure sufficiently that it changes its view, it changes its mode of action and rejects this the fulfillment of the Zionist project, and that Israel could face severe pressure if the United States were to change. That also is not currently in the offing, though it's more likely than it has been at any point since the founding of Israel. So I think it's a matter of mobilizing civil society to insist on international law and the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people.
Okay, Professor Lynk, could you elaborate a little bit more? What can civil society do to improve the level of compliance with international law, or to introduce additional provisions to international law that will make it easier to enforce the existing systems? I think lay people don't understand that international law has actually evolved, especially after the two world wars, as a result of civil society demanding that we can no longer live in a world where the strong can simply attack and annex and take over property of their weak neighbors. And there was a robust civil society that has contributed to the development of international law. So is there anything specific that you think international civil society can do in the different countries to enhance this process?
Yes, look, I'm in full agreement with what Richard has said, and that I think he and Francesca would agree that international law by itself would not liberate Palestine, but it is an invaluable political and campaign tool by which to point out what rights have been granted, the right to self-determination, the right to have a state of your own, the right to have and enjoy human rights, the right not to have a occupying power stay for any longer than it needs to in order to restore order and return sovereignty to the people under occupation. When I think of this, though, when I spoke at the Human Rights Council last March, a year ago, delivering my report on apartheid, my 12th and final report as Special Rapporteur addressed the question of apartheid, and I concluded that apartheid was embedded into the occupation, that it was an occupation that had transformed itself into an annexation, that had transformed itself into apartheid. And I said, when I delivered my report, when I was speaking to the Human Rights Council, I said, I would not be up here today delivering a report stating that that apartheid is now an integral component of Israel's occupation of Palestine, had the international community taken its own laws seriously 45 years ago and 35 years ago, enforced them at that time when the wellspring of resolutions were flowing from the General Assembly and the Security Council, if they had put them into place then, when there was perhaps only 60,000 or 80,000 settlers in the occupied Palestinian territory, that would have been reversible. It's hard now to think 40 years later, with the occupation now almost 56 years old, how reversible the occupation is, with more than 730,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and Gaza barricaded in a way that I cannot think of any other similar situation anywhere in the world, even where you find areas of intense repression. Where 2 million people are barricaded behind a high wall and fence with no freedom of movement and no ability to be able to leave or enter and join the rest of the world. So when we think of all those things, I say that international law is incredibly important because it's the promise that states make to each other and to their own citizens with respect to what they're going to uphold. So just like Martin Luther King said, in the famous mountaintop speech he gave the night before he died, when he said, what we have to do is make those rulers commit themselves to what they've already put on paper. And it's the same thing I say with respect to all of these resolutions with respect to the Israeli occupation. It's up to us to require our own governments, and I assume most people here are either in the United States or in Canada, to make our own governments push Israel to obey the resolutions that the world has agreed upon, that Israel must has an obligation to be able to follow through on.
Thank you. I apologize to everybody. My video seems to be erratic, but the important people you are hearing very well. I want to give one more question before I open it to our audience, who have, I'm sure, very important questions to ask all of you. Would either of you, any of you, the three of you, wish to comment on the current situation in the occupied territories, particularly with this new government that seems to be composed of some very, very radical elements, and that these elements now have control. They have the authority over the occupied territories, and these are precisely the kind of elements that have been very involved in violating Palestinian rights all along. I'll start with you, Francesca, and then maybe ask the other two professors.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to take this question with an American audience or a North American audience, because I'm really disappointed with the way what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territory is portrayed these days. I often hear the term escalation or flare up. There's no flare up. I mean, there is no flare up and no calm after the flare up subsides. This is, I mean, the escalation is probably in our attention when things get absolutely wrong or absurdly wrong. But I often say in the occupied Palestinian territory, the violence is daily, structural, and it's embedded in the very nature of Israel's 56-year-old occupation. It's important that we remind ourselves of the origin, of the root causes of the structural violence. And it's the colonization that Israel has perpetrated over the occupied Palestinian territory, which has turned into subjugation and depredation of millions of people. So what is happening these days is extreme, and it's the consequence of not hearing, not listening, not acting upon what, for example, John Dugard, Richard Falk, and Michael Lynk have recommended for decades altogether. And the situation is going to become worse and worse, clearly not just for the Palestinians, but also for the Israelis. And it's important, and this is the second element I wanted to bring to the discussion, it's important that we make the link between what's happening in the occupied Palestinian territory and the government that has been sworn in, the government that has eventually been brought to power with very extreme members. But again, I mean, the situation is not new, certainly not for, the violence is not new, certainly to the Palestinians who have been for decades under occupation, because I often quote these days what Amira Hassa said. Even liberal governments, leftist governments in Israel have been military juntas for the Palestinians. So in conclusion, yes, what's happening is unprecedented in terms of massive violence unleashed and totally uncontrolled. And it's fully video documented with the settlers attacking defenseless Palestinians and the army standing there. Now you can see what the army is for. Even those who didn't want to see, now they must see. And again, I agree with Michael, there is no other, and Richard, there is no other ways to stop it than imposing the measures recommended by the UN Charter. So economic, political measures to sanction Israel.
Okay. Professor Falk, any thoughts?
Yes, I very much agree with the tenor and the passion of Francesca in expressing this sense of both the long experience of repression and its evolving intensification. Both those things are essential to our understanding. And I like to say that what we're experiencing now is the attempted end of the long game of the Zionist project. And by that I mean Netanyahu's government is, I think, not something that he would like to have be more moderate. He has these extremists given strategic positions that wasn't necessary to do in order to sustain his coalition, so that they could do the dirty work. He could stand by and purport to be trying to moderate what was happening and keep good relations with the US and so on. it's a little bit hard for him to do it in view of the genocidal kinds of settler violence that has been encouraged by members of the Netanyahu government. But what we're seeing, I think, is this last phase of a settler colonial project enacted in a historical period where colonialism has been discredited all over the world. And it takes this geopolitical muscle of the US and to some extent Europe to sustain the illusion of a legitimate Israel in the face of all that has happened. And I agree with Michael that the UN is crucial in establishing what the proper contours of behavior are in a situation of this sort. It cannot change the behavior, but it can create symbolic understanding that is extremely important for civil society, because it relies on this more objective presentation of the relevance of international law, the responsibility of civil society, the need for global solidarity that imposes real costs on Israel for continuing on this path of apartheid that with its genocidal implications at the present time. And again, I would end by saying the South African situation looked hopeless until it became feasible. And what made it feasible to have this unexpected transformation was the mobilization of civil society, global solidarity, in conjunction with a worldwide UN campaign that legitimized the struggle and the boycott and the divestment of and sanctions directed toward Israel. Nothing less will result in any kind of positive transformation.
And I agree with what Richard has said. And if I can say two things before we turn to the question. One is, and this is to build upon what Francesca has said, you know, the occupation, the Israeli occupation is requiring increasing levels of violence in order to be able to maintain itself. And I see no hope that this is going to taper off anytime soon in terms of the number of Palestinian deaths, in terms of injuries, in terms of the number of settler attacks on Palestinian property, in terms of home demolitions, in terms of number of people, Palestinians now in administrative detention. These numbers are all trending upward and will continue to trend upward, because I think you have an extraordinary restlessness among the Palestinian people, particularly in the West Bank, who are unsatisfied with the non-protection that the Palestinian Authority can provide them, and realizing, alas, you know, they're largely on their own with respect to this. The other thing I just want to point out, and it goes back to, I think, a theme we touched upon a little bit at the beginning of this panel, is the absolute importance of civil society organizations in the United States to be able to address issues with respect to their own government. This occupation would not have lasted 56 years was it not for the almost entirely unconditional support of the American government. If I can just use the Security Council as one example of this, since 1973, since in the last 50 years, the United States has, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has vetoed resolutions 81 times. That is by far the most number of vetoes by any of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations. 42 of those vetoes, over half of them, had to do with Israel. 32 of those 42 had to do with the Israeli occupation of Palestine. 2 weeks ago, the Palestinians, with the support of the United Arab Emirates, had tried to bring a resolution to the Security Council, more or less reiterating what the Security Council has already said in prior resolutions with respect to the fact that the annexation is illegal, that the Israeli settlements are illegal, and the Security Council was opposed to the announcement by Israel that it was going to be building almost 10,000 housing units in the settlements, and it was going to be approving, I think, the legalization of 9 outpost settlements. The United States threatened to veto that, and what they got instead was for the Security Council to issue a milquetoast statement from the president of the Security Council, which did not mention the settlements as being illegal, and which put most of the blame, in fact, the longest paragraph in that statement has to do with Palestinian terror, as opposed to the much greater numbers of violence issued by Israel. If I can, and the last point I want to make with respect to this, if you go to the UN numbers, I'm looking at the United Nations OCHA office for the Palestine. It says that since January 2008, which is 15 years, Israel, 6,226 Palestinians have died between January 2008 and the middle of February 2023, and 289 Israelis have died. So that's a ratio of over 21 to 1, and that gives you an idea, I think, of the extraordinary asymmetry between Israel and the Palestinians in terms of their power and their ability to be able to use violence against each other.
Okay, now I think is the time for us to open it for questions from the audience. We have several hundred participants, and I'm sure many of them have some interesting perspectives, but we are looking for questions. And as we wait for these questions, I want to offer one other question to ask you. What is the responsibility of third parties, countries other than Israel, for complicity with clear violations of international law, including crimes under international law of Israeli behavior that other countries are complicit with? Francesca, you want to start on that one?
Sure. If I may add just one comment to what Michael said regarding the sort of complicity of certain states vis-a-vis Israeli practices. I mean, look at the recent referral to an advisory opinion to the case of the legality of the occupation and its violation of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. A number of Western states have either abstained or voted against. Even this is considered like a political move, something to oppose, and this is very vicious because the Palestinians are left really with nothing to defend themselves in the view of these states. And I've engaged with some member states who said no, but we voted against because we are against unilateral measures. Seriously, I mean, the only unilateral measures that should be sanctions are the set limits. And I go to your question. So for me, okay, we need to go back to the law of state responsibility. Israel should comply with international law. But pending its lack of compliance, there are responsibilities for other states in general. So without going into specific situations, so there is an obligation not to recognize the illegal act and its consequences. Any situation that is generated by the international wrongdoing, the colonies or whatever, or the attempted annexation, nothing should be recognized as legal. And second, there is an obligation to bring the legal act to an end using all possible means, pressure, diplomatic pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, which means sanctions, which means divestment from Israel. And then, of course, there is also another obligation to ask for reparations. Not many talk about that. But what happened in Hawara needs reparations. The extrajudicial killings should be investigated and lead to reparations every time there is an illegal act asserted. And so this is the level, again, the level of normalization of the brutality of this occupation has reached a point really that requires a sort of introspection. I mean, it's really tarnishing the remedial and regulatory function of international law. So it's very wrong in many ways. One last issue I wanted to point out is the settlements. Especially because, again, we are talking to a North American audience, and I will leave to Michael the comment on the trade agreement that Canada has with Israel. But something I often tell Europeans is not just about denouncing and condemning the settlements. The settlements do constitute a war crime. Because this, and Michael in one of his reports has explained it beautifully. So there shouldn't be any engagement, any dealing, any business, any trade with anything that concerns this illegality. At least to start with the settlements. But then it's also impossible to disentangle the settlement enterprise from the states. And again, so the settlement products should be banned from any international market and not just labeled, because labeling this product means putting the burden on the consumer, and this is really, it's a fig leaf. And the other thing also, there are pension funds. I'm starting to dig into this, pension funds investing into the settlements. This is immoral because someone naively trying to secure their future by putting money into a pension fund. Well, if they fund the settlements, they are destroying future and present of millions of Palestinians.
Is it also illegal or just immoral? Is there a duty and obligation, a violation of the law by those funds pension funds that fund the settlements?
Look, there is a question of due diligence that is, and then again, I think that Michael is already better placed than me, because this is something that I'm starting to study. It's not something that I've really investigated already, and I can comfortably comment on it. But there is a question of due diligence that comes into place. And so there are already a number of institutions which are divesting, or even pension funds which are divesting from businesses, for example, that are involved in the building of the settlements and demolishing of the Palestinian structures. But this is not enough, because again, if we look at the overall settlement enterprise, whatever activity, even those even businesses or pension funds connected to water, to the use of water, this is, in my view, illegal. But it needs to be explained. It needs to be articulated in a way that is understood, so that also the private sector, banks, and pension funds understand very well what they're doing.
Okay, there's a question here about the right of resistance. Do Palestinians have the right to use armed resistance against the occupation? Professor Falk, would you want to address that?
Sure. It seems to me that if you accept the settler colonial optic as descriptive of the situation of this prolonged and now unlawful occupation, there is a distinct legal foundation for the right of resistance within the scope of international humanitarian law. And that right is premised on the right of a people to resist colonialism. And that's or at least it's been made explicit in General Assembly Resolution 2625, which addresses self-determination and also, incidentally, the right of resistance. And that right of resistance extends to situations of severe violations and systemic violations of human rights. And certainly it applies in the context of Palestine at this point.
Thank you. Another question from Lynn McAllister. Is there any mechanism for the United Nations to provide a protective presence for the Palestinians? Professor Lynk?
The answer is yes. The question is there the will, particularly by the Security Council, to be able to do so? The protective presences have been offered, obviously, through the range of peacekeeping that has been done at least since the mid-1950s by the United Nations. There's a very rich history with respect to this. And one would have thought that, given that no country in the world recognizes the claims of Israel to East Jerusalem, the West Bank, or Gaza, that the international community, if determined to do so, could put international troops there in order to be able to protect Palestinians as part of the roadmap to end occupation and have the Palestinians realize their own state. I think actually this is something I think is in the early ways of discussion, but I think there is actually a powerful argument to be made that the international community should be pushed to provide international protection. It's obvious that what is happening on the ground is the confiscation of more and more Palestinian land, the rapid rises in both Palestinian deaths and injuries. All of this indicates that we're walking farther away from any final, just, durable peace involving Israelis and Palestinians, and that only through some kind of international presence would there be a reversal of this and some kind of pathway to peace.
Could I just add a word to what Michael said? There is a specific norm of R2P, responsibility to protect, that was adopted by the Security Council in 2005 and misapplied actually to Libya in 2011. But it's a mechanism that was designed to protect a vulnerable, abused people after the Kosovo War. It was brought about in the aftermath of the Kosovo War. And if any people in the world are abused, vulnerable, and deserving of this kind of protection, and it is rooted in a responsibility of the international community and the UN. So I think the case is really overwhelming at this stage, and it's a scandal that the UN and some ad hoc coalition of states haven't been advocating the application of the R2P principle.
Thank you.
Can I make a
Go ahead,
comment?
Francesca.
Yeah, and again, because of the lack of, because of the expected veto within the Security Council, it's unlikely for the time being to see a peacekeeping operation on the ground. At the same time, because I make this call over and over, that Palestinians need protection. Palestinians need protection, and there is no one on the ground. I mean, all those who have seen or have watched in shock what happened to Hawara residents, but again, there are plenty of these cases every day in the occupied Palestinian territory. Know what I mean? There is a need of a force that interposes itself between the Palestinians and the Israeli army and the Israeli settlers. And I've advocated for it, even including with a call to the humanitarian forces on the ground, because there is an army of humanitarians, I mean, internationals on the ground, to consider doing what UNRWA did during the first Intifada, when there were no other UN agencies, major UN agencies, that UNRWA and probably ICRC on the ground. UNRWA started sending out international officers as just in places, sensitive places like checkpoints and refugee camps, and they're very present. Diluted the possibility, I mean, created some pressure on the occupation forces. I know that it's risky, but people need to understand what the Palestinians are enduring and take action.
Okay. Dori Slutsker has a question. Is the two-state solution still a viable option? Would any of you care to address that?
I can start off.
Okay, Michael.
And I'm speaking for myself, although I think I have an inkling of what Richard and Francesca might say as well. But it seems to me that we've long passed the the last exit on that road. Maybe when there was 50,000, maybe when there was 150,000 settlers, that might have been reversible. Although, even though there were Israeli voices in the 1980s who were saying that that number was going to make it irreversible. But recall this: 10 years ago, when the United States began the last effort at a peace process, Secretary of State John Kerry said, "Look, we have 12 months, maybe most 18 months, before the window to a two-state solution winds up closing, and then it's going to be apartheid." He said this 10 years ago. I think, if anything, he was late in the day with regards to this. It strikes me as incredible to think that if Israel suffered a nervous breakdown by moving 8,000 settlers from Gaza in 2005, how you reverse this by removing 730,000 settlers from East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and another 20,000 settlers who live in the Syrian Golan Heights, to be able to create a two-state solution. I think, when you realize what a small piece of land this is, and that there are 14 million people living between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, half of them are Israeli Jews, half of them are Palestinian Arabs. The only real future that they have is going to have to be one based on equality and human rights and a rights-based approach. And that seems to me to dictate it's going to have to be some kind of democracy. I teach constitutional law. I mostly with respect to Canada, but I've paid attention to constitutions elsewhere in the world as well. And what you have to think about is that there are a lot of creative solutions to learn how different peoples can live within one political entity and live in prosperity, live with a shared future, and live with the cornerstone of rights and equality in mind.
Okay. There is a technical question from somebody that US officials are using the term rules-based international order. Is that different from international law? Is that an attempt to avoid or obfuscate the question? What is a rules-based international law? Professor Falk?
I think the best short answer is what the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, means by rule-based order is Pax Americana. In other words, it clearly doesn't mean international law, and has some applicability within the scope of international trade and international economic and commercial relations. But when it comes to peace and security and human rights issues, it's totally irrelevant to talk about the U.S. support for rules-based world order, because it's as Michael pointed out, 81 vetoes were cast by the U.S. in order to avoid those rules, and so it's a kind of hypocritical way of sort of suggesting vaguely that the West adheres to international law while the rest of the world, and especially our adversaries, Russia, China, the Palestinians, they are either terrorists or geopolitical rivals. It's a way of dividing the world into good and evil and claiming that we inhabit the domain of the good. And those that don't follow those rules, and he has and Biden have always been careful not to talk of a rules-based order as synonymous with international law, and they've never defined what it is they mean by it. And I really do believe what it means is a U.S. dominated global security system.
Well, here's a question for Michael. How can we as Canadians hold our government accountable for their support of apartheid Israel?
I commented a few minutes ago about how important American support for Israel means shielding it from any form of accountability and extending impunity. Though Canada is only if you like, a middle power on the world stage, it has voted in almost all UN resolutions on the side of Israel and against Palestinian rights over the last decade and more. My sense is, let's take a page from a society that we can compare ourselves to, which is Ireland. Ireland has a very active civil society movement in support of Palestinian rights. It doesn't hurt the fact that the Irish lived under occupation and rule or misrule by Britain for several centuries, and they still have that as a very central feature in their national memory. But they are debating now whether or not to pass an Occupied Territories Bill through the Irish Parliament. I think an Occupied Territories Bill, which would ban the import of goods and services from illegal civilian settlements wherever they have been created, wherever there's been an occupation, would be one great step forward in a place like Canada to be able to show some accountability along the lines of what Richard and Francesca has said with respect to Israel's behavior in the occupied Palestinian territories. So taking concrete measures that we can ask our parliamentarians to perform on, such as an Occupied Territories Bill, or to live up to no trade with the settlements. We have actually passed in Canada, adopted the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court into Canadian law, which says that civilian settlements are a war crime. A war crime is as serious a measure as you can proclaim in international law and in domestic law. Why aren't we demanding that our own parliamentarians take that seriously with respect to their own laws?
So can we sue in Canada for settlement activities?
There is. There's a possibility of suing. I think there's also the possibility of using progressive voices within the Canadian Parliament to be able to do that as well. And if I can say this before, I know time is going to run up fairly soon, but I just want to say to everybody here, because I know a lot of you are joining us because you want to see action done and you're wondering what action you can do. We all know what Martin Luther King Jr. said about the arc of history bends slowly, but it does bend towards justice. And I just remind everybody that that what was added onto that was what his spiritual lieutenant, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, said. You know, the arc of history does bend towards justice, but we have to make it bend. We have to do that ourselves.
Yeah. May I comment
Francesca,
on
go ahead.
and also because there was a question, I mean, I'm not reading all the questions, but there was one from Minzy that caught my attention because she was asking what can we do apart from bombarding the Congress people with letters. Again, I don't think that this is necessarily one of those battles of historical battles for justice that is going to be won just because the main policymakers at the international level they are not the ones who will provoke the change. They will follow eventually. But this has happened already with South Africa. But there was a huge movement here. And here's the thing. There is no the civic space to discuss the question of Palestine, to even inform people, to even tell what's happening is shrinking. And for a number of reasons, but what I mean, it's very hard for the Palestinians and for the Israelis who stand with them to have their voice heard. So very, very important is to push to create this space for the Palestinians, because as Arab Canadian lawyers have denounced, there is a huge phenomenon of anti-Palestinian racism, and it's completely underestimated, and it should be announced, but also addressed. The other thing is that it's very important to call out the media for their complicity and the way they misrepresent what happens in Palestine, because there is this huge projection of Palestinians as terrorists, again, which is generated by the misunderstanding of their right to resist and the conditions and indignities they endure every day. But again, it can only be addressed by changing the language that is usually employed, and it carries a lot of racism against the Palestinians and biased. And the third element is to address private businesses. Yeah, again, because these are in a way smaller fishes in the pond compared to for example, US or Canadian administrations, but this is something where the public opinion can provoke big shifts in my view.
Thank you. One last question before I give you a chance to sum up about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. That's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association Act. I'm not sure what it is. This definition of anti-Semitism that combines almost any opposition to Israel or Zionism and labels it as anti-Semitism. How do you feel that impacts the ongoing attempts to address international law? Anybody?
Wants to start? I think that
Okay,
we are the three of us have
Francesca, go ahead.
rant already.
Go ahead, Francesca.
It's very problematic. It's very problematic from a number of points of view because methodologically is flawed, and it conflates criticism against Israel as a state, which should be scrutinized as any state, with meaning anti-Semitism as discriminating against the Jews as Jews. So it leads to paradoxical and absurd situations, like the fact that you cannot utter a word against Israel, otherwise you are anti-Semitic. And the three of us have paid the brunt, and I'm paying the brunt for it. So it's, again, this is a huge factor of shrinking the space for civil society and for denunciation and of what Israel does, and for asking accountability. So it's extremely dangerous, and it also endangers the Jews, because again, every Jew is held responsible, can be held responsible for what Israel does, which is absurd.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. We want to be conscious of the time of the many people who are with us on this very valuable presentation. I believe we can send a copy of the recording to everybody who has registered for this event. But I want to give our three panelists an opportunity to give their summation, a final word, and also a reference to the book and how useful and important the book is, so that everybody can utilize it as a resource in their advocacy work. Shall we start with you, Professor Falk?
Sure. And thank you very much for allowing this very broad discussion to take place and having moderated it in such an illuminating way. I think our book serves as a foundation for understanding why it's necessary for civil society to act at this point. I mean, I think the evidence that we collect over a period of 20 years cumulatively makes this case of civic responsibility on the part of those with a conscience for and compassion for the suffering of others, of innocent others over time. And we have learned, I think, in this process that although international institutions are useful, they can't do the heavy lifting where geopolitics gets in the way. And in no issue in my lifetime has geopolitical obstruction so prevented a just outcome of a conflict between two peoples. And if we keep that perspective in mind, we will be more motivated to take action. I would just say, in a final thing, that in the South African precedent, which we should all study because of its transformative success, sports and cultural boycotts were extremely effective in reaching the elites in South Africa and making them feel that their lives, they couldn't just punish the Africans, that they were feeling the pain of apartheid themselves. They were beginning to feel the pain of apartheid themselves, so they had an incentive to move away, to try something else. And that was defied I was in South Africa just a couple of years before Mandela was released, and no one there expected that there would be a change without a bloody civil war. And the fact that nonviolent global solidarity proved so effective there is something we can all learn from.
If I can just add this, this is the book itself, and
Yes.
at Richard's great suggestion, all of the royalties from the book are going to go to the charity Playgrounds for Palestine, which I think is an excellent charity and organization to be supporting. I'm always reminded, as I like him as one of my favorite authors, what Albert Camus once said. He said that the calling things by their wrong name only adds to the afflictions of the world. And that's why I think I and Richard before me and Francesca after me, are calling this an example of apartheid and calling this an example of settler colonialism. The ability to, and that's not to denigrate any people. That's to denigrate a system of injustice that winds up allocating unequal rights based on ethnicity and nationality. And that's what's going to be at the core of this. And that's why I think we all welcome the fact that there's many progressive Jewish organizations, both within Israel and around the world, who wind up supporting this struggle for Palestinian rights, and let that great bridge between Palestinians and Jews wind up continuing until there is justice in the Holy Land.
Francesca,
Yeah, I
Final
think
words.
I'm one of the first who had the privilege to read the book as it was in the final stage, because I was offered the possibility to contribute a foreword to it. And I loved it. I really think that it's a fascinating account, because the three of them, my distinguished predecessor, write beautifully, and this is not necessary. I mean, in a way that make international law accessible, which is not easy for any lawyer. But there is a mix of their personal account and an explanation of the UN system. So there are many layers of understanding that this book promotes, and many reflections that it triggers. So I really encourage everyone to read it. As we move forward, I can only ask people to continue to show their solidarity with the Palestinian people through action. It's really time to reenact a pact of solidarity with the Palestinian people, because again, their situation has reached a point of, I mean, it has been intolerable for many years, but now it's really, really serious.
Thank you. And before we end, I would like to urge all of you, if you haven't read the book yet, to order it, to read it, to ask your public library to carry it. And if you have the skills to do so, write a summary of it, write a book review of it for your local paper. Make sure that it gets a wide coverage. And I want to again thank our three panelists, and thank all of you who have been with us on this event. And thank you very much, and God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye. Bye, Richard.
Bye.
Bye.